might find comfort in storing your private belongings away, tucked neatly inside lockers or hidden behind the cold steel doors of a storage unit. There's a certain security in the idea that your secrets, your keepsakes, are sealed from the world. But sometimes, the contents locked away in those quiet, forgotten places are anything but ordinary. In fact, some are deeply unsettling. Take this, for example. There's only one time when it's even remotely acceptable to have a headless doll in your possession, and that's the brief moment between your dog tearing its head off and you discovering the damage. Any other situation, it's not just strange, it's disturbing. But what happens when someone not only keeps a headless doll, but carefully places it among an array of knives? That's not just weird, that's a warning. But what happens when someone not only keeps a headless doll, but carefully places it among an array of knives? That's not just weird, that's a warning. Robert Dewey Hoskins, a name you might not recognize at first, was once at the center of a chilling case that blurred the line between obsession and violence. He had a history, a dark one. In February of 2012, Hoskins was readmitted after escaping from a mental hospital. His name had already made headlines before for something far more terrifying. He had been convicted of threatening to murder Madonna. And when investigators opened up his storage unit in Long Beach, what they found wasn't just bizarre, it was nightmarish. According to LA Weekly, the list of items inside Hoskins' storage space read like a twisted inventory from a horror film. The most disturbing, a mutilated baby doll, headless, its soft plastic body stained and discolored, lying lifeless among a dozen razor-sharp knives. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't forgotten, it was placed there, deliberately. But that was just the beginning. Tucked inside that grim little vault were other items that hinted at something deeply wrong beneath the surface. There was a terrifying clown mask, its smile grotesquely exaggerated, the eyes hollow and black. You can almost imagine it sitting silently in the shadows, waiting. Next to it, a sumo wrestler baby doll, its eyes unnaturally wide, its plastic skin faded in places like it had been handled far too often. Then, a Barbie backpack, childlike, innocent, and completely out of place. And there was more, so much more. Each object pulled back the curtain just a little further, revealing glimpses into a fractured mind, a mind spiraling in darkness. These weren't just personal items, they were relics of obsession, fragments of a terrifying fixation that went far beyond celebrity infatuation. No one knows for sure what Hoskins planned, but when you look at the things he chose to keep, the things he locked away, protected, preserved, they speak volumes. Sometimes what we hide away says more about us than what we show the world. And sometimes it's better if those secrets never see the light of day. A married couple, living what most would consider a normal life with their 2 children, was thrust into a waking nightmare, one that began with a simple, almost innocent discovery. It was the mother, Mrs. Copeland, who first noticed something strange. While tidying up her 10-year-old son's room, she stumbled across a safe. Small, metal, and wedged awkwardly beneath his bed, as if it had been hidden in a hurry. She hadn't seen it before. It wasn't something they had bought, and they certainly hadn't given it to him. Her brows furrowed with confusion, and she called out to her son. When he entered the room, she gently asked where he had gotten it, and, more importantly, what was inside. His response chilled her. He just stared at the floor, wide-eyed, lips pressed together. Then came a single, pleading word, whispered so softly she could barely hear it. "Please." He said nothing more. No matter how many times she and her husband asked, their son wouldn't explain where the safe came from or what it held. His silence was total, unnerving. Eventually, Mr. Copeland decided to force the truth open, literally. With a crowbar in hand and a sinking feeling in his gut, he wedged the tool into the safe's edge and pried it open. What he found inside would haunt him forever. The instant the lid gave way, a thick, metallic scent hit the air. It was unmistakable: blood. And then, before he could even process what he was seeing, it spilled out. Blood, thick, dark, and still wet. His scream shattered the silence of the house. There, crammed inside the small metal box, was the severed head of their beloved family dog, the same dog that had passed away only weeks before. They had all mourned her. They had buried her together with tears in their eyes in a quiet patch of the backyard. And yet, here she was, or at least part of her. The horror turned to disbelief and then to something deeper, something no parent ever wants to feel. Because standing behind him, staring unblinking at the grisly scene, was their son. His small voice broke the silence. "I loved her," he said. "I loved her so much. I just wanted to keep a part of her forever." His tone was eerily calm, too calm. He explained that after they had buried her, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He couldn't stand the idea of her being so far away, underground. So he waited until late one night, crept out of bed, and dug her up. With trembling hands and a tiny kitchen knife he had hidden away, he had removed her head. Then he placed it gently in the safe, his way of holding on to her forever. Mrs. Copeland could only stare, frozen in disbelief, her mind struggling to understand what her son had done and why. And the safe? She had only found it earlier that same day. Some people bring their work home out of dedication, others for darker reasons. But Dr. Michael Birkeland, a former medical examiner, didn't just take his work home. He stored it in a dim, musty storage unit in Pensacola, Florida. And by work, I don't mean paperwork or files. I mean human body parts. Dozens of them. Over 100 people's remains. The grim truth came to light in August of 2012 when an unsuspecting buyer purchased the contents of Dr. Birkeland's storage unit at a routine auction. What they expected to find, old furniture, maybe some forgotten boxes, was nowhere in sight. Instead, they opened the unit to discover a horror show no one was prepared for. It was like stepping into a refrigerated nightmare. Inside were shelves and coolers crammed with containers, some labeled, many not. They held hearts, lungs, skin tissue, even brains. 10 of them. 10 human brains, stored like leftovers. Some were floating in yellowing fluid, others wrapped clumsily in plastic and sealed in Tupperware containers, trash bags, and specimen jars. And it didn't stop there. In one especially morbid find, police noted a human heart sloshing inside a styrofoam cup. The cracked plastic lid was barely holding, allowing a slow leak of formaldehyde to seep through. The chemical smell was overwhelming, acidic and sharp. It stung the eyes and turned stomachs. Detectives were stunned, not just by the grotesque inventory, but by how casually it was all stored. No temperature control, no refrigeration, just a dusty, rented space in a back alley row of storage units. Even more chilling was the realization that these remains had all been taken during private autopsies performed by Dr. Birkeland himself, usually in funeral homes throughout Florida. He had kept them, cataloged them, stored them like a grim personal archive. Why? No one could say for sure, but the deeper investigators looked, the stranger things became. As it turned out, Dr. Birkeland had already been fired from his role as a medical examiner nearly a decade earlier, back in 2003. The reason? A long list of professional failures. He had neglected to complete autopsy reports on time and allowed a massive backlog of cases to accumulate. It was chaos beneath the surface. And now it all made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just about incompetence anymore. It was about obsession, about secrets stuffed into cups and bags and boxes, locked away behind a steel door, hidden from the world. Until one day, someone found them. Unit B didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. Just another metal door in a long row of self-storage units at a quiet facility in Clearwater, Florida. But what it held inside was something no auctioneer could have prepared for, something that couldn't and shouldn't be sold. The story came to light in January of 2012 when a family fell behind on their storage payments. Standard procedure followed. The facility manager contacted them, letting them know the contents would soon be auctioned off if the overdue balance wasn't settled. That's when the truth surfaced, slowly, awkwardly, and with the weight of years behind it. Hidden among the clutter, banana boxes, old TVs, broken furniture, was something far more chilling. Something sacred, something forgotten. The skeletal remains of a grandmother. Authorities later confirmed her identity as Anne Bunch, born January 1st, 1900. She had died in 1995, nearly 2 decades earlier, and ever since, her body had remained sealed inside a small, painted blue coffin tucked away in the back of that storage unit, left there, unburied, unmoved. For 17 long years, her remains lay undisturbed inside that metal box. The unit itself had no air conditioning, just dry, stagnant heat that built up during Florida's blistering summers. It should have reeked. It should have deteriorated into something far worse. But it didn't. The funeral home in Alabama that originally prepared her body had done so properly, embalmed, sealed, preserved. That meticulous preparation explained why, all these years later, there was no overwhelming odor, no rotting mess, just bones and silence. Still, the discovery sent a wave of unease through everyone involved. Why had the family stored her there? Why hadn't she been buried? Was it out of grief, guilt, or something else entirely? No one could say. But what lingered more than the mystery was the haunting image of it all. This forgotten coffin, resting in a dusty unit among the relics of a life moved on. An entire human story, packed away like an old lamp or a busted television, unseen, unspoken, until the lock came off and the past was forced back into the light. Plenty of people avoid public pools for all sorts of reasons. Too many germs, too many strangers, the smell of chlorine lingering in your hair for days. But after hearing what happened at one particular pool in Colorado, you might just add another reason to the list. His name was Jacob Pastor, an elderly man who swam regularly at the local public pool. Quiet and polite, Jacob kept to himself. He wasn't there for small talk or to socialize. For him, swimming was a ritual, steady, peaceful, familiar. And every single visit, he used the same locker in the changing room, always the same one. The place was rarely busy, and most of the lockers just sat there, unused. It wasn't the kind of facility that saw crowds, so no one questioned his routine. But one afternoon, something was off. Maybe Jacob had pushed himself too hard during his laps. Maybe his mind was fogged by exhaustion. Or maybe, and this is the part that makes your skin crawl, maybe something wanted him to open the wrong locker. Because that's exactly what happened. Instead of opening his usual locker, Jacob reached one to the side, just a few inches away, almost identical in every way. As the metal creaked open, something shifted behind the door. Something heavy. Then it happened. A collapsed heap of bones tumbled out, fast, sudden, violent. It didn't just fall, it lunged forward, crashing into Jacob with such force that he stumbled back and fell hard onto the tile floor. It was as if the remains had waited there and chosen that very moment to break free. The sound echoed, a hollow, dry rattle of skeletal limbs clattering against the cold floor. Shattered silence. Jacob's scream rang through the locker room. What lay before him was the fully decomposed skeleton of a human being. Whoever it was, they'd been in that locker for years. There was no flesh, no moisture, just brittle, yellowing bones curled in on themselves, like whoever had once worn them had died curled up in agony or fear. There were no signs of struggle on the outside of the locker, no lock forced, no scratches. It was as if they had simply stayed there, sealed in silence. Investigators couldn't determine exactly how it happened. The size of the locker was just barely large enough to fit a body, but it was tight, cruelly tight. Whoever had ended up inside would have had to fold themselves in like a suitcase, or someone else did it for them. But how had no one noticed? No smell, no complaints, no disturbances. That mystery, how the body got there, who it once belonged to, and how it remained undetected for so long, remains unresolved. All that's left is the image of bones spilling onto a locker room floor, and the uneasy feeling that sometimes the past doesn't rest where it should. Imagery user, though most people just called him Old Wagon, wasn't your average locksmith. He was a reformed thief, a man who had once lived by picking locks and cracking safes under the cover of night. These days, he'd cleaned up, sort of. Now he made an honest living, well, mostly honest, by helping people open safes they'd long forgotten the codes to. Usually it was a dusty box full of tax documents or heirloom jewelry. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But one job would change that forever. It began like any other day, with a landlord calling Old Wagon for a routine safe crack. A tenant had moved out months ago, leaving behind a heavy, rust-colored safe in the back corner of the apartment's storage closet. The landlord didn't have a key. He just wanted it open so he could haul it off and re-rent the unit. Old Wagon showed up with his usual tools: wires, clamps, digital meters. No torch, not for jobs like this. Nothing that could melt the contents. Just finesse, quiet, clean work. He crouched beside the safe and started hot wiring the mechanism. It was an older model, and the locking system gave in faster than expected. With a soft click, the tumblers fell into place, and the heavy door creaked open. But the moment it did, time seemed to stop. because inside that cramped metal tomb was a live grenade. Old Wagon froze. So did the landlord, who had been watching nervously from behind. The device was small, aged, but unmistakable. A real, live grenade resting silently in the dark, like it had been sleeping for years, waiting for a reason to wake up. And that wasn't even the worst part. Behind the grenade, tucked deep in the back of the safe, were several SD cards. Thin, black rectangles lined up in neat rows, almost too carefully placed. And next to them, a thick leather journal, its edges worn from frequent handling. At first glance, the cards seemed harmless, but once they were examined, the true horror emerged. Every single card was filled with child pornography. The journal? According to Old Wagon, it was worse than anything he'd ever read in his life. He couldn't even bring himself to describe it in full. He later said the pages felt wrong in his hands, like the words themselves were diseased. He flipped through just enough to understand what he was looking at. Then he closed it fast. "I won't tell you what was in it," he said afterward, "because if I did, you wouldn't sleep tonight." The authorities were called immediately. Every piece of evidence, the grenade, the SD cards, the journal, was confiscated by law enforcement and turned over to a specialized task force. And the man who had left the safe behind? He vanished. But investigators believe he wasn't just a collector of sick material. He was the ringleader of an underground child pornography network. The contents of that safe weren't just disturbing. They were evidence, clues, leads. Thanks to Old Wagon's quiet skill and a little bit of luck, one of the most vile hidden operations in the region was cracked open. Sitting quietly behind a steel door in a forgotten safe that no one thought was worth unlocking. Until now. Fort Collins, Colorado. The year was 1987, a quiet town shaken to its core by the brutal murder of a local girl named Peggy Hetrick. Her death was violent, mysterious, and deeply unsettling. The crime scene, marked by cold precision and eerie silence, left investigators grasping for answers. And then they turned their attention to a high school student, a boy just 15 years old. His name was Timothy Lee Masters. When authorities searched his school locker, what they found would burn itself into their memory forever. The small metal space meant for textbooks and lunch bags was packed with darkness. Over 2,200 pages of violent, disturbing writings. Detailed, obsessive. Page after page of stories soaked in blood and cruelty. Alongside them, dozens of horrific drawings, mutilated bodies, torn flesh, cold eyes. And the most haunting part? Some of those drawings bore an uncanny resemblance to the crime scene where Peggy Hetrick had been found. It was more than enough to raise alarm, and it didn't take long for suspicion to transform into prosecution. At trial, the sheer volume of disturbing material became a weapon in the courtroom. The jury looked into the eyes of a teenager and saw something twisted, something dangerous. Timothy was found guilty. At just 15 years old, he was sentenced to life in prison, condemned not just for what he was accused of doing, but for the violent world he had created on paper. But the truth has a way of waiting in silence. 2 decades later, in 2008, everything changed. Advances in forensic science, technology that simply didn't exist back in 1987, finally told a different story. DNA evidence, more precise and unforgiving than any piece of writing, revealed the unthinkable. Timothy Lee Masters hadn't done it. He hadn't acted on his twisted imagination. He hadn't murdered Peggy Hetrick. The disturbing stories and artwork in his locker weren't blueprints. They were the expressions of a troubled, imaginative, perhaps even deeply misunderstood teenager. He was acquitted, set free after years behind bars. But the shadows of the case linger. Because despite the breakthrough, despite the exoneration, one devastating truth remains. Peggy Hetrick's killer has never been found, and someone, somewhere, still knows what happened that day in 1987.
When Mr. Shannon Whisnant won a BBQ smoker at a routine storage unit auction, he expected a good deal, maybe a chance to fix it up and resell it, or even use it for weekend cookouts. But what he got instead was something he would never forget, something no one would forget. As he inspected the smoker more closely, he noticed something strange tucked inside, something wrapped in layers of tinfoil. Curious and a bit unsettled, he slowly peeled the foil back. What he found inside wasn't meat. It was a human leg. Severed cleanly below the knee, dried and aged from time, the limb had clearly been there for a while. At first, it looked like the beginning of a grisly murder mystery. Whisnant called the police immediately, and for a brief moment, the story took on the makings of a true crime nightmare. But the truth was far stranger than fiction. Authorities launched an investigation and quickly traced the origins of the severed leg. It didn't take long to identify the previous owner of the storage unit, Mr. John Wood. And when they contacted him, he was surprisingly calm. It turned out the leg wasn't the result of foul play, but a tragedy. Wood had survived a plane crash in 2004, one that left him severely injured. His leg had to be amputated below the knee, and in the aftermath, he made an unusual request. He wanted to keep the limb. His reason? He wanted to be buried with it. Some people find comfort in that, keeping themselves whole even in death. But somewhere along the line, things went sideways. Wood had placed the leg, cleaned, wrapped, and sealed, in the BBQ smoker for safekeeping. Then, over time, through moves or life's chaos, he forgot it was there. And the smoker? Eventually placed into storage. Years later, with missed payments and abandoned property, the unit went up for auction. No one knew what was hidden inside, least of all Shannon Wisnant. What followed was a bizarre, sometimes even comical, legal back and forth between Wisnant and Wood, each claiming rights to the leg for their own reasons. One wanted dignity, the other publicity. In the end, the story isn't one of murder, but of memory. Of how something once part of you, flesh, bone, identity, can be lost, locked away, mistaken for something far more sinister. A leg in a smoker. Not a crime, just a forgotten piece of someone's life, waiting in the dark until someone finally opened the lid. While refurbishing an old derelict house on the outskirts of town, a woman named Controlla was hoping to breathe new life into what had long been forgotten. The place was falling apart, crumbling plaster, warped floorboards, and dust thick enough to coat your lungs. But beneath all that decay, there was potential. Charm, even. And then she found the wall safe. It was buried behind a layer of old plaster in one of the upstairs bedrooms, barely noticeable unless you were already tearing the place apart. Square, rusted at the hinges and sealed tight. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Her heart skipped. Maybe it belonged to a former owner. Maybe it held cash, jewelry, or old family heirlooms. Hope stirred in her chest. But just to be safe, she called in a locksmith. It took about 15 minutes for him to crack it open, the tools clicking and buzzing against the aging mechanism. When the lock finally gave way, there was a long pause. The kind where everything feels still, like the air itself is holding its breath. And then the door creaked open. Inside wasn't gold, or documents, or anything remotely valuable. Just a small pile, a scattering, a handful of human teeth. They weren't bagged or labeled. They weren't neatly stored or preserved. They were loose, yellowed, some cracked, some with dark roots still attached. The kind of teeth that looked like they had been ripped out, not carefully extracted. Controlla just stood there, staring into the darkness of the safe, her stomach turning. There were no notes, no context, just those teeth. The locksmith stepped back slowly, his face pale. "That's not something you see every day," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. And he was right, because those weren't the kind of remains you accidentally misplace.
Someone had put them there on purpose, hidden them, sealed them away behind layers of plaster and time. But why? Were they trophies? A relic of something far more sinister? Or just a deeply personal, twisted secret no one was ever meant to uncover? No one could say. And in that quiet, decaying house, surrounded by creaking wood and walls that seemed to breathe, it suddenly didn't feel like Controlla was alone.
A Reddit user by the name of a lumberjack thought he knew every inch of his house. But one day, during what began as a routine inspection near the basement water heater, he discovered something strange, something that didn't belong. Tucked away behind the wall was a small crawl space, narrow, cramped, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. But this wasn't just a dusty alcove for pipes or wiring. No, this one was different. The floor was carpeted, and it led to a black door. There were no hinges on the outside, just a single rusted lock. It looked old, but not forgotten, like it had been sealed on purpose, for a reason. He stared at it for a long time. The silence around him stretched out, heavy and stale. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something metallic. He couldn't sleep in the house again, not until he knew what was on the other side. So he broke through. Behind the door sat a single object, huddled in the farthest corner, like it had been placed there to watch. A sentry safe, black, looming, waiting. The carpet beneath it was pressed flat, as if it had been there for years, maybe decades. It took effort, but eventually he got it open. Inside were several VHS tapes, old, dusty, and unlabeled, except for one. Scrawled in trembling handwriting across the sleeve were the words, "No, no, no, no." That's all it said, but somehow it was worse than any detailed explanation could have been. Lumberjack stared at the tapes, heart pounding, skin crawling. Something about them felt wrong, not just old home movies or forgotten memories. Something else entirely, something deliberate. And then he found the note, tucked behind the tapes, written in what looked like thick black ink that had bled into the paper, was a message. Save yourself. 2 words, that was it. No name, no context, just a final warning from someone who had clearly seen what was on those tapes and wanted no part of it ever again. He didn't sleep that night. 8 months ago, Lumberjack updated the Reddit community. He had turned the tapes over to the police.
No word ever came back on what was on them, and part of him is grateful for that, because sometimes curiosity doesn't lead to answers. It leads to something far darker.